Hello there, everyone. Need I say any more as to why we've been so silent about the coronavirus, medical martial law, the collapse of the political economy taking place right before our very eyes, and all of the other developments which have been occurring around these events, which have probably been tuned out because your focus has been drawn to the hysteria in the media? It's kinda difficult to even open up a video like this. In fact, it took Filthy and I nearly 2 whole days to even put a single word on our script. But a few things have happened specifically, which both of us feel construct a clear enough understanding of what's happening, what the state is attempting to do, and why, that at least I feel we can create a video talking about the state media's narratives surrounding these subjects without new information coming out a day later, which will force us to have to reframe our entire argument.
The propaganda machine of the government media complex has been cranked up to full blast, broadcasting a message of terror and futility to make you, dear viewer, feel helpless in the face of this once-in-a-lifetime global pandemic, ripe for top-down isolation, oppression, and exploitation. Entire sectors of the economy are being shut down, such as the restaurant industry in 26 states, plus Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico at the time of this recording. In California, New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, all sectors of the economy deemed non-essential have been shut down. I should also mention the school closures in 46 out of 50 states, but let's be honest, this is also a benefit. This is devastating for the businesses themselves, but they do not exist in a vacuum. The economy is a vast, interconnected series of supply chains that have now just been hacked into pieces by a drunk Jedi with a lightsaber. Restaurants closing, or at least seeing massive losses due to only being able to do deliveries or takeout by decree of their divine overlords, results in less revenue for their suppliers. These suppliers, from farms to grocery stores, have to now downsize operations. Hospitals are considered essential by the state. Laundromats, not essential. Yet without laundromats, how will their sheets, pillowcases, and other clothing items be sterilized? In addition, how will they get food if the restaurants and the grocery stores are receiving less supply? Tourism industries are going to plummet, including hospitality and travel. This disruption expanding outwards, leaving millions of people out of work and millions more at risk of unemployment. Many Americans live paycheck to paycheck and may be one missed pay stub away from being unable to put food on the table. Estimates from a 2017 survey putting that percentage of 78%, with God knows how many Americans in debt who would be unable to make payments and therefore have their homes or vehicles foreclosed on. This is an economic disaster of improbable proportions. Certainly, a market would have taken measures voluntarily to limit the spread of a pandemic because pandemics are bad for business, but all this isn't a result of organic market activity. It's because the state has the power to demand private property be shut down. Whether or not the political economy the state is creating in response to COVID-19 is an overreaction to a perceived pandemic or is a calculated response to a false flag event the government engineered, I'll let you decide. The important part is that the state is creating a wartime economy. In the name of public health, the state must dig its boot into the neck of your liberty, cutting off our ability to breathe, and for many people, quite literally. Businesses like GameStop that refuse to bend the knee to the divine overlords in the political ruling class get their commercial licenses revoked and are forbidden from doing business. Because obviously, living in a free country means you have to beg permission from your rulers just to be able to sell things.
But trust us, guys. Everything the state's doing right now is totally in the aims of your interests, to try and stop the spread of the coronavirus. I mean, Jesus Christ. That might have fooled a few people at first, but you'd genuinely have to be either not paying that close of attention to what the state's actually doing, or a full-fledged fucking retard to believe the Mockingbird media's narrative at this point. You're forcing local businesses to shut down to prevent the spread of the virus, but aren't doing the same for some of the bigger corporations who operate in the exact same markets? What's that about? For an organization who's benevolent and is only becoming more aggressive against us and expanding its influence into our lives to try and stop the spread of the virus, it sure does seem to be selective over who they're coming after, and for some reason to want to make it as difficult as possible for people to obtain the resources which they need to continue surviving. Threatening people with violence over saving up their own supplies because the shortages, and the state making it difficult for people to so much as leave their homes. That's weird. If you wanted people to stay inside and away from other people, why would you stop them from saving up their own supplies so that they can isolate themselves from others? The state seizing privately owned guns citing the coronavirus because of fucking course. The state forcing private labs who experiment with coronavirus test kits to create cures to close down and stop their research. I don't know about you, but it seems like the state doesn't really care as much about the virus as they'd like you to believe. In fact, it seems as if, at best, states are indifferent to whether or not the virus spreads. What they really seem to care about is the collapse of the white market political economy and trying to maintain their global financial infrastructure which they're dependent on in order to fund the services they need to continue operating around, by attempting to make it as difficult as possible for people to not only avoid associating with white market firms, but to document as much of their daily activity as possible with the state directly, and to try and socially engineer conditions which incentivize more spending than would naturally exist in a vain attempt to manufacture demand for loans. I doubt this comes as a surprise to longtime viewers of this channel, but there's a much stronger case to be made that this narrative is the case than the one which the state would like you to believe, since pretty much every narrative the state tries to build through the media and politosphere is misleading and designed to trick you into seeing whatever is required to benefit the state class's interests as being interchangeable with that of your own. Every single day, the Fed has been creating trillion-dollar loans to loaning agencies to prevent the global white market economy from collapsing due to coronavirus slowing down spending, and also simultaneously to prevent the political economy from collapsing due to coronavirus creating what they call panic buying. Not only this, but it came out in November of last year that 97% of all white market firms don't use GAAP standards of accounting for their returns, and hadn't for over a decade. And for perspective, revenue is a GAAP standard. So even if you were to get past the atrocious debt to GDP ratio, and debt being created in contrast with government revenue and marginal production, you'd still be faced with the fact that white market firms themselves are faking their returns in order to continue appearing to be making a profit, with the debt compared to real production being 95% of GDP, along with an increasing amount of their resources on paper not representing resources in the real world that are actually produced and sold to people. I don't know about you, but these explanations seem to be based on a model which both has no way of being falsified within its own internal reasoning, but also provides two explanations which simultaneously contradict one another. But then you begin to delve deeper, and the state actually began increasing the frequency of their so-called quantitative easing cycles months ago, since at least the summer of 2019, which that alone suggests the state's new legislative decrees and the stock market trends we've been seeing lately are not motivated by a response to the virus. Not only that, but on a conceptual basis, the state-approved economist explanation for what's happening couldn't ever be an accurate assessment because it makes several core assumptions about interest rates and market trends which don't pan out to observable reality. Having a central bank manipulating interest rates in any way doesn't do anything other than create false market signals. It doesn't create more supply to have the Fed go through a QE cycle. It just creates the impression that a greater supply of resources exists than actually does. The Fed causes unsustainable malinvestment by injecting funds into the loanable funds market because investment money isn't obtained through delayed gratification. In other words, lenders aren't loaning money with the expectation of eventually being paid back through returns. They're receiving funds in the form of artificially printed money while also loaning money to borrowers. Lenders are both simultaneously sending the signals that they're lending and receiving their money, and borrowers are still borrowing the lender's money. If you understand the concepts of scarcity, or that numbers on a piece of fucking paper don't do anything for either suppliers or consumers unless said numbers represent something more than government-prescribed fiat, then the problem here should be immediately apparent. Which is the reason that things such as stagflation can exist. Which, by the way, is present in the current depression. In models which assume that interest rates are prescribed, such as those created by Keynesians, monetarist, or neoclassical theorists, inflation and productivity are thought to be at odds with one another. The mere fact that inflation and decreasing productivity can occur at the same time completely undermines any arguments that central bank intervention could stop depressions. Yet this is hardly the first time we've seen stagflation during either a recession or a depression. It was present in the 1973 automobile recession, the 1981 general recession, and even the Great Depression of 1929, just to name a few instances, which would also explain all the debts defaulting at the moment, which the Mockingbird media is completely ignoring. Or the state has been declaring that these debts no longer need to be paid, so that the media can frame it as something that the state did as opposed to the systemic collapse of an entire industry.
You've got mail.
What's this? In the past two flu seasons, November to April of 2018 to 2019 and 2017 to 2018 respectively, 48.8 million people in total were infected with influenza, which resulted in 647,000 people being hospitalized, along with 61,000 deaths, and 45 million people were infected, with 810,000 people hospitalized, along with 61,000 deaths. So influenza, also known as the common cold, every year infects around 40 to 50 million people, puts close to 1 million in the hospital, and kills nearly 100,000 of those people, while COVID-19 so far has been around since December of 2019, and as of writing this video has infected 375,000 people, has a mortality rate of around 1% for anyone under the age of 60. For people above the age of 60, the mortality rate only goes up to about 10%. Yet not only is there not a global geopolitical pandemic freakout every 6 months, but the stock market isn't affected either way by the annual influenza outbreak, despite influenza being statistically more dangerous and affecting more of society than COVID-19. Now, that's not to say that COVID-19 isn't a biohazard or an attempt to downplay its significance, as some controlled opposition personalities in the media have tried to do in a shallow attempt to pay lip service to skepticism of the official state narrative, given that despite the constant propaganda in the media trying to either place blame on what caused the virus upon some group or entity, the state in question has an interest in trying to galvanize and paint as an antagonist in its socio-political narrative, or to try and scare people into accepting the state's boot upon the back of their necks while they try and salvage the dying political economy. Most people seem to be rightly pointing out the inconsistencies in what the state's saying. We can safely say, though, that central banking was the true cause for this depression, as Austrians have been warning about for years now, and the state's daily QE cycles, which seem to be growing in number with every single new one, along with the presence of this ominous "your life is about to fundamentally change" talking point that's being parroted by every state media outlet, it appears that on the bright side, even the state doesn't seem to be confident that it's going to continue sustaining itself. However, that does not mean that the state doesn't have a plan which it's following, or that it isn't going to try and sustain itself by lashing out one final time and prop up a new political economy in the place of the crumbling old world.
Every day, there's another injury on our freedom. Donald Trump, not long after declaring a state of emergency, signed into legislation the Defense Production Act. What this does is appropriate private property from their rightful owners to be used in production of goods and services the state determines to be valuable rather than the people. Trump is already using this by forcing General Motors to produce ventilators. I thought the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Now, the economic calculation problem identifies that the information required for economic central planners to allocate resources efficiently cannot exist under central planning. As such, any government-mandated production will exacerbate shortages and raise prices. This is even ignoring the ethical question of whether the government is justified in using the threat of violence and throwing people into cages indefinitely to coerce people into doing certain things with their own property. Spoiler alert, they aren't. You said throwing people into cages indefinitely? Heretic, you must be exaggerating. Sadly, no. The US Department of Justice is trying to gain the ability to detain people indefinitely without a trial. The way it works is that there's a thing called the Statute of Limitations. It dictates how long a government can detain someone before a trial, and failing to bring them to trial, they have to let them go. What the DOJ wants to do is suspend the statute of limitations for the duration of national emergencies. Recall that on Friday, March 13th, and since then, Trump declared the COVID-19 pandemic to be a national emergency, giving the Department of Justice and various other federal and potentially even state and municipal legislation enforcement agencies the ability to kidnap Americans for any reason they wish. All that's asked of them is they invent a justification under the vaguely worded charge of civil disobedience. Right now, the state is politely asking people not to hoard sanitation or medical supplies as their patriotic duty. But let's be honest, it won't be long now before those National Guard troops being called into California, New York, and states all across the country are going door to door in search and to prosecute so-called hoarders. If this crisis is nothing else, it's been quite revelatory of a number of things. For instance, the extent to which the state will simply ignore the restraints on their own power. They can suspend the Constitution at any point under the pretense of a crisis. It's just like when you sign a contract for a mortgage that allows the bank to decide if it can even give you the money promised, but you still need to make monthly payments, plus interest. Oh wait, that never happens because it's fraudulent, and nobody would want to do business with them ever again. So why would people accept it when statists unironically push forward social contract theory and the state unilaterally suspends its own obligations and restraints? It's almost as if those obligations and restraints never existed to begin with. Oh yes, the crisis has also been revelatory for knowing who the free thinkers and who the mindless sheep are. Those who know the state is using this crisis as a means to gather more power, and those who mindlessly believe that these restraints need to be cast off for the good of the American people, of course. We know these restraints never existed to begin with, and social contract theory is meant to trick people into believing the state's malevolence against mankind is in any way restrained. This isn't just in the US. China, Italy, Spain, France, Ireland, El Salvador, Belgium, Poland, New Zealand, Australia, Germany, Argentina, Morocco, Kenya, Puerto Rico, Czech Republic, Malaysia, and other countries by now but not listed at the time of this recording are all in various states of lockdown, ranging from shutting down international flights to closing down businesses central planners arbitrarily deemed to be non-essential and threatening people to stay in their homes. While everyone is distracted with the coronavirus, the US government is trying to push through totalitarian censorship legislation like the Earn It Act, a bill designed to have all internet communications in the US be monitored through a supposed third party chosen by the state, while giving the Attorney General of the United States the authority to determine what forms of internet communication are or are not acceptable. You know, the Attorney General, head of the US Department of Injustice, who wants to suspend the Constitution and detain people indefinitely, where we have it on record that the current Attorney General Barr is opposed to end-to-end encryption and will probably ban it if given the power. All that Earn It would require is that Barr justify his censorship in the name of preventing child exploitation, and he, or a potentially less restrained successor, has free reign to do with the internet as they see fit, with no repercussions or reprisal. Though, even worse is what's happening in Israel.
Netanyahu gives himself broad phone-tapping powers to fight the invisible enemy, coronavirus. What, is the coronavirus a cognito hazard now? Yeah, there's a reason that they're trying to make sure you don't hear about their overt nationalization of communication, because they know that there's no way to contextualize this in any other way than one which makes it blatantly obvious that their true intentions here are to integrate all aspects of society together around centralized networks, which can be controlled by either the state or financial institutions influenced by the state, starting with all online communication. Though this is going to force all white market online corporations and other forms of centralized networks to comply, like all other aspects of the market which the state has come after recently, this has not suppressed trade, it's only forced the trade in these specific commodities to operate around decentralized networks and local subversive infrastructures, along with incentivizing people to move into gray or black market economies and to speculate more of their resources into developing a more secure means of trading. Not unlike what happened during the Great Depression of 1929, when the food rationing started and when FDR started going full Nazi on the economy, people began trading within counter economies with gold and silver as a means of exchange. In short, I don't suspect that in the long run this will actually harm encrypted communication. On the contrary, this will just end up creating an incentive for people to migrate to decentralized platforms, since said platforms will be the only ones which can serve as a secure line of communication. Which is exactly why the state, when it wants to suppress something, usually doesn't use coercion. They'll use co-optation. They'll try to subvert the industry around whatever revolutionary product was created, so that in order to legally trade it, someone who wishes to trade it would need some sort of license, or they need to go through some channel which the state completely controls or has influence over. Like what happened with the internet in general, for instance. This is more evidence to show that the state is not only desperate, but also has no coherent long-term strategy for its own continued existence. The state is being forced to engage in tactics which its own intelligence agencies know are ineffective and 100% of the time will backfire for the sake of merely trying to keep the lights on for a few more months.
But does the scale of the threat justify the response? Of course it doesn't. Right and wrong does not change because people don't want to get sick. Every government action, mandate, and statute is done with the implied threat of violence against peaceful people. This injustice is independent of circumstance, location, or time period. But let's ignore all that. Is the government's rampant and naked oppression justified in combating COVID-19? The trouble is inherent in the testing. It involves sticking a pair of Q-tips several inches into people's nostrils. Suffice to say, unpleasant. That, and most people who are going to be tested are those either extremely at risk or showing symptoms. Given the limited capacity of testing in many countries, some of it by design, such as private clinics in the US, by the hundreds being prevented from testing by the government, it's difficult to tell how many actual cases of COVID-19 infection there are, and people who are likely to die from it are severely overrepresented. A perfect example is the Diamond Princess cruise ship and its quarantined passengers and crew. There was a 1% fatality rate. The trouble is that the passengers were overwhelmingly elderly, a demographic at greater risk of fatality from any infection, and not just COVID-19. Adjusting for actual age demographics of the US, it would put the disease's fatality rate at 0.125% on average. Due to the small sample size, there is a very large range of statistical deviations, from 0.625 to 0.025. More dangerous than the flu, sure, but considering historical pandemics, it's not nearly as significant. Everyone generally knows the swine flu pandemic of 2009 was a nothing burger of a pandemic. I personally recall making many jokes about the non-pandemic with my friends. It was just a way for us to get out of government schools, which sadly didn't happen. It killed 12,000 Americans. The 1968 Hong Kong flu killed 100,000, and the Spanish flu of 1918 killed 600,000. At the time of this recording, 2,600 Americans have been killed by COVID-19, and let's be honest, more are going to die. Their deaths are tragic, and I don't want to diminish the harm and suffering this illness is actually causing. But let's keep this in perspective. We didn't see this kind of rampant and runaway government authoritarianism in 2009, when the US was afflicted with a pandemic of a much greater scale, or in 2014, during the height of the Ebola pandemic, which is vastly more lethal than COVID-19. So does the scale of the current pandemic justify government authoritarianism? Ignoring ethics completely, well, there's no way to give an objective answer. The only standard available is the subjective preferences of whomsoever is asked. But the question is put forward. How did our divine overlords in the states get their power? By what standard are they justified in having that power? Why are people, who may or may not have consented to this person having this power over them, obligated to obey? Why are they in the wrong? Should they disobey? And can this standard of right and wrong be explained without appealing to an ethical standard that can be used to justify literally anything, such as utilitarianism, consequentialism, or legalism? Of course not. The information to create an accurate and proportional government response does not exist. And because of the economic calculation problem, the government is incapable of giving an effective and efficient response. No matter which way you slice it, everything the state is doing can only be wrong. This is what tyranny looks like, dear viewers. And now, aside from the obvious interest the government has in controlling people's behavior and movements, who else benefits? The Mockingbird media gives wall-to-wall coverage of the coronavirus, using sensationalist headlines that play up this event as a global pandemic. using scary-sounding language while citing information that gives people the wrong impression about the scope of the actual problem. Everything is designed to scare you. Naturally, the government wants you scared too, but when people are scared, what do? They go watch the news. They click on news websites. Your clicks and your views give them money. The media and the state is directly profiting off of your anxiety. They aren't going to stop if they can help it. They want you afraid, so you will be exploited. They want you alone, so you are easier to arrest quietly. The state is a greater threat to you than any virus ever could be. The virus and the government's authoritarian response to it is a huge subsidy to large corporations. These lockdowns, in place in state after state, county after county, for big corporations it's annoying, but for small businesses it's positively ruinous. You think they have the resources to be in lockdown for weeks at a time? Of course not. It's not even a question of if they're considered to be an essential business by the rulers, since this fear-mongering has coerced people into avoiding doing business. Suffice to say, they're finished, leaving big businesses there to hoover up that market share. The biggest winners of all are big pharma.
One of the most common mistakes people make when discussing the interests, function, and structure of corporations that specialize in the pharmaceutical industry, especially in the United States, is to assume that the white market for this area is a natural product of free association, i.e. a lack of government intrusion into the market is what caused the current conditions which these firms operate around. This couldn't be further from the truth. Next to finance, delivery, or fuel, the pharmaceutical industry has the most cartelized supply chain of the industries in the white market economy. We've been seeing this particularly with the coronavirus, how hundreds of gigabytes worth of research data on COVID-19 are being hidden behind paywalls of sites hosted by state-run academic institutions and intelligence agency-controlled media outlets, and we only have access to the so-called corona papers because of torrenting websites run by agorists. Along with patent laws allowing these pharmaceutical cartels to use the force of the state to shut down competing projects experimenting with open source treatments, or 3D printed parts being developed for oxygen masks among other commodities which would normally cost a few $100 being printed for the price of $1 worth of filament, the extent to which the FDA, CDC, and UN are openly manipulating the production policies of pharmaceutical corporations such as Mylan or Sanofi, along with deliberately making it more costly, require more investment time, and also needing to meet a ton of arbitrary licensing requirements in order to merely test a coronavirus kit, ensure that the state has de facto complete control over not only the entire pharmaceutical industry, but how the coronavirus pandemic is being handled in the legal markets. Through patent systems, licensing laws, finance manipulation, price fixing, along with the establishment of international cartels such as the World Health Organization, and policies being enforced by financial cartels such as the IMF, the World Trade Organization, or the World Bank, states around the world effectively have a total monopoly on the production of healthcare and pharmaceutical drugs, and they treat this aspect of the political economy in much the same way as they treat the financial institutions they've established. They make it virtually impossible to legally be a provider of service in this aspect of the market without brown-nosing to various government agencies and financial cartels for licenses and permits, along with making it impossible to get said licenses and permits without putting yourself through the steps which give financial institutions tremendous leverage over you. Student loan debt, for example, to ensure that you will go along with what they say, likely before they would even need to use force to shut you down if you did something which was unsafe to their interests. Every firm and industry in the regulated aspect of the economy has some of these features to an extent, but why is this particularly apparent for some industries over others? I mean, you see the patent system being used to benefit a few organizations, and subsidies being granted to some of the bigger state-connected corporations. However, you don't see entire new agencies being created specifically around the interest of a few corporations in, say, the gaming market, like you would with the fuel industry, banking, delivery commerce, or healthcare. Well, it's because healthcare and pharmaceuticals in this case are markets where demand for loans can easily be manufactured, so to speak, by states using political means, which in turn generates more revenue for the states in question, giving the states in question both more direct and indirect influence over how people associate in what they trade, along with what their incentives are. So that way, purely hypothetically speaking of course, if various governments around the world were to, say, create a virus through gene splicing, they could engineer the virus they created in a way so that it could only be cured using a drug or drugs which only one corporation would have a patent on, meaning that in order to legally obtain the medicine being advertised as a cure, you would have to associate with this specific firm. Not only this, but the state can make it so you need a prescription to even obtain this drug legally, i.e. you could only legally buy the drug if you went to a state-influenced hospital and a doctor whose following policy is designed around the state's interest prescribing it, meaning legally that the state has absolute and total discretion over how said drugs are distributed and under what terms you'd be allowed to have said drugs. Realistically, all this does is incentivize more people to join biohacking communities and find more ways to distribute drugs through open source networks, similarly to what's happening with communication in the internet. But nonetheless, the state will still threaten those who attempt to get around their stranglehold on legal production with threats of violence. But, of course, that's purely a hypothetical scenario. It's not as if COVID-19 is made up of a couple different diseases which can't mutate together naturally due to having too much genetic variation between them. It's not as if the CDC began allocating more resources towards opening quarantine centers and hiring program managers months before the COVID-19 outbreak. And it's definitely not as if the government has been lying about this outbreak from the very beginning, suppressing actual outbreak numbers while claiming the virus originated in Chinese wet markets, even though the very first coronavirus patients had no association with wet markets. It's not as if the corporation which has a patent on the drug which is being advertised by the state and its media has a patent registered to the pharmaceutical conglomerate Mylan, which is partnered with just about every swamp creature one could possibly name, among whom is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Why do I highlight the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation specifically? Well, after the coronavirus outbreak started plaguing the news, through an AMA on Reddit, Bill Gates himself announced that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had sponsored an organization called ID 2020, which, you can't even make this up, officially is stating that their goal is to put what they refer to as digital signatures in vaccine shots. What is a digital signature according to ID 2020? A microchip, which the state would be able to detect and tell whether or not you've been given a shot, because it's a microchip which is implanted into your body through shots administered by state vaccines.
We rightfully recognize historical totalitarian regimes for the extent to which they outsource their surveillance state to their subjects, who white-knighted to their divine overlords by turning in their neighbors, friends, and family to state agents if they were disobeying the regime, such as people being insufficiently enthusiastic about the revolution during France's reign of terror, Germans harboring Jews in Nazi Germany, or suspected capitalist infiltrators in numerous Marxist-Leninist regimes. This is exactly what's happening in Kentucky, California, and presumably in other states, as simps for the state snitch on their neighbors, friends, and family for coughing. Kentucky, in particular, set up a phone hotline for Kentuckians to do just that. The reasoning behind that is in order to stop the spread of COVID-19, the Kentucky priesthood of statism needs to punish all failures to comply with social distancing mandates with government force. While one can make the argument that encouraging people to keep to themselves will help slow the spread of the pandemic, this loops right back around and endangers people by exposing innocent people with an irritated throat to the possibility of being murdered by overzealous, power-tripping cockroaches called upon by a paranoid neighbor. In the novel 1984, subjects were encouraged to snitch on others if they were suspected of being thought criminals. I agree with what Congressman Thomas Massey said in response to Kentucky's embrace of Mr. Orwell's cautionary tale as an instruction manual. Make Orwell fiction again. I would be genuinely surprised if Kentucky is the only state in which this is happening. Though in Rhode Island, they've skipped right to the end of the book in an act of pure Nazi Germany-style malevolence. The governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, has ordered police and National Guard to go door to door looking for Jews who might be seeking refuge in her state. They are legally allowed to be there, and in many cases own property there. Yet without even the pretense of due process, these Jews are being dragged from their property and subject to fines and jail time. Oh, and when I said Jews, I meant New York City residents. But considering the high Jewish population in New York City, that's not a big stretch, is it? And to make matters worse, Trump signed an executive order allowing the Pentagon to bring troops into active duty, even from the reserves, to bolster the ranks of the jackboots to victimize your rights. After the footage of Abrams tanks being carried through San Diego and Long Island, New York on trains, I have to wonder how long until full martial law is declared, and any pretense of a government having any sort of restraint whatsoever in its ability to enslave you is gone. In the name of public safety, the walls of your jail cell are being built around you. They will encase your body in concrete and call you safe. This is the kind of tyranny we've been warning about for years, and the time to prepare was last month. Every crisis, from 9/11 to the 2008 financial crisis to today, is just another in a long list of excuses for legislative proposals to keep you shackled long after the crisis has passed. If you think a government is going to give up its power after this is over, you're delusional. Now, before we wrap this up, let's make a few things clear. The coronavirus pandemic is not a hoax. It's a very real and very nasty illness that is hurting a lot of people. It's not just the flu, as some have been suggesting. The flu leaves you tired, nauseous, and vomiting for a day or two. The effects of COVID-19 are described as feeling like you're drowning, and permanent damage is inflicted on your lungs and kidneys. So, yeah, good practice is staying home when you can, washing your hands, and using hand sanitizer that seems to be freaking everywhere these days. Avoid large social gatherings, and keep tabs on the spread of the virus in your local area. Make plans accordingly. Hoarding non-perishable foods is also a good idea when you can get to the grocery store, as there's no guarantee you'll be able to in the future. And yes, I am overtly recommending hoarding.
Everything which the state is engaging in as of recently is an attempt to achieve the following goals. Firstly, the last thing the state wants is for people to have their own resources and the ability to form independent associations with them. On top of the counter-economic potential this creates, posing a massive threat to the infrastructure of the state's political economy, it means that people don't need to go to the breadlines once the state begins rationing food, among the other commodities the state is trying to centralize. Which is a big problem for the state because central to the state's current strategy of trying to sustain itself is to attempt to gain leverage over people through centralizing resources. For those who don't really understand the interests of the state or operate around the framework of social contract theory, it ought to really make you question why the state specifically wants people to be dependent on it, or to use its resources, as opposed to a firm raising prices in response to an increased demand, a group of associates pooling together resources voluntarily and distributing them to other people in the community based on demand they voluntarily associate with, or a family hoarding resources, as the authoritarian propaganda likes to characterize it, which are all functionally forms of rationing, just not inherently dependent upon and controlled by the state. And why the state propagandists seem to be so uncomfortable with acknowledging this, to the point that where, in order to even address the subject, they have to poison the well in an attempt to mislead people into believing that the state isn't even expanding its influence over the aspect of society in question, or they have to pull a bait and switch by framing the discussion around models for how resources are produced and distributed, as opposed to why the state incessantly seems to be aiming to try and monopolize the distribution of as many commodities as it deems to be in its interests. So the state is going to try and stop people from saving up resources for themselves or to trade, and it seems that their initial propaganda campaign wasn't very effective based on the fact that the state is now threatening violence against anyone who it deems to be hoarding resources.
This too shall pass, and for virtually all of us, we're going to be fine. However, the real threat is the state. Their rampant authoritarianism is a disease masquerading as a cure far, far, far worse than the actual literal disease. The liberty the government is seizing now will not be returned to you voluntarily. And we also know with absolute certainty, once the crisis has passed, propagandizing to you how much worse this would have been if you weren't enslaved. I shouldn't need to explain why that's absolutely nonsense. But anyways, there is also a crackdown on communications as part of their ongoing campaign of internet censorship. With this in mind, we will be shutting down the Backalley Discord server and affiliated servers and moving to XMPP on Saturday, April 18th. You can check the announcements tab on the Backalley server for information on how to download an XMPP client and connect. Put simply, Discord is compromised. They'll give your communications, recordings of your voice, chats, and text logs to the government if they just ask politely. It simply isn't safe to be using the platform for anything except apolitical things like gaming or talking about sports ball. Even then, I wouldn't recommend Discord unless you want the state to know your hobbies, interests, and have enough of a record of your writing that they can ID you through your word choice, syntax, and sentence structure alone. XMPP is peer-to-peer and decentralized, significantly safer, and a lot less resource intensive on your computer than Discord. So if you want to connect with Esso or I, that'll be where you do it. So, yeah. Anyways, Esso and I just want everyone to stay safe. So, do that, okay?